Okay, let's talk about the major shift happening in global politics, and more specifically how the US is redefining its place in the world. Over the last week or so, we've seen some pretty major changes in US foreign policy, which seem to indicate that the US is stepping back from its role as the dominant superpower. This is setting the stage for a new global order, one where the US isn't the sole superpower calling the shots, but where other nations like China, India and Russia also define the rules. I'm going to give you my opinion on why this is happening, what it means for the US and the world, and what this shift might mean for global power dynamics. I'll also discuss US foreign aid, shifting alliances, and why the end of the US hegemony isn't necessarily as chaotic as it may first appear. To understand this shift, let's start with one of the most fundamental changes, the dismantling of USAid. Over the years, the US has used foreign aid and international institutions to maintain its influence around the world. But now we're seeing a deliberate step back from this. USAid, for instance, has been a tool for promoting American interests under the guise of supporting development, democracy and human rights. However, there's been growing skepticism both within the US and in other parts of the world about how these funds are used. Much of the money has ended up fueling opposition movements, destabilising governments that aren't aligned with the US policies, and to finance protests or dissent. While it's true that a small percentage of this aid goes towards actual development projects, much of it has been seen as serving geopolitical purposes. And now, under the Trump administration, there's been a move to cut back on this aid. This isn't just beneficial for the US, it's also a big win for the countries that have long been recipients of this aid, but have been wary of its real intentions. The move away from foreign interference may be seen as a step towards ending the US's role as the global police. But it also marks the end of an era of American-led global influence. And it's not just foreign aid that's being revalued. We're also seeing a fundamental shift in how the US views its allies. This change became very clear with the implementation of tariffs on countries that have traditionally been close partners of the US, like Mexico, Canada, and even the European Union. What we're witnessing is a redefinition of what it means to be an ally of the US. In the past, the US often saw itself as the indispensable nation, with a duty to maintain global stability and promote its values. But today we're in a multipolar world. As Marco Rubio put it, the old world order, one dominated by the US as the central force, no longer makes sense. There are now multiple great powers on different continents, each with their own interests and priorities. So basically, the US, instead of trying to dominate the whole world, will only try to dominate its sphere of influence. The tariffs on allies in this light make a lot of sense. It's not just about punishing countries, it's about redefining the relationship. The US no longer wants to treat these nations as vassals or subordinates. Instead, the US seems to be moving toward a world where alliances are more fluid and based on mutual, evolving interests, rather than loyally being a single hegemonic power. This new reality is really shaking up the global order, and it's forcing countries to rethink how they relate to the US and to each other. The days of the US calling all the shots may be over, and that's leaving many of its old allies uncertain about their place in the world. As I mentioned earlier, foreign aid has long been a tool of influence, but now that the US is stepping back from its imperial role, there's growing acknowledgement that this aid often has harmful side effects. The money that was meant to support development and democracy often ends up stoking political instability and funding movements that undermine local governments. In fact, many governments around the world, especially in the global south, have expressed a preference for cutting these foreign aid ties altogether. There's a growing sentiment that the US needs to stop using aid as a political tool, especially when it's clear that much of the funding doesn't actually go towards the people who need it the most. In this new paradigm, cutting USAid funding isn't just about saving money for the US. It's also about giving countries the space to develop on their own terms without the constant interference of foreign powers. For the US, moving away from these programs could be a way to avoid further entanglement in global conflicts and reduce its military and political commitments abroad. For many countries, it's a chance to reclaim their sovereignty and forge new paths of development without the constant shadow of foreign influence. Now, all of this might seem like a sign of decline for the US, but I would suggest that it's actually a more controlled withdrawal from an unsustainable empire. Instead of continuing to pour resources into maintaining a global hegemony that's becoming increasingly difficult to sustain, the US is choosing to prioritise its core national interests and focus on what it can realistically achieve. This is not to say that the US will stop being a major global player, or that it won't continue to pursue its own interests aggressively, but the days of trying to police the world and maintain an iron grip on global affairs may be coming to an end. The US seems to be shifting its focus inward, realising that its previous approach was costly and ultimately unsustainable. The global implications of this shift are profound. For one, we're entering a new era of multipolarity where power is no longer concentrated in the hands of a single superpower. Countries around the world are now going to have to navigate a more competitive and fragmented global environment where no single nation will dictate the rules. For US allies, this shift is going to be especially difficult. The US has long been the pillar that has held these Western blocs together, but as it steps back, these countries will have to find new ways to engage with one another and the rest of the world. No longer able to rely on the US as the central authority, they may need to forge new partnerships based on mutual interests rather than old loyalties. For the US, the end of the empire doesn't mean the end of its role in global affairs. It may become a more disruptive force, acting in its own interests without the pretense of maintaining a rules-based order. But this might be a more honest and sustainable approach than continuing to prop up a system that obviously no longer works. In conclusion, what we're witnessing is the end of an era. The US is stepping away from its role as the global hegemon, acknowledging that the world has changed and that it can no longer afford to maintain its empire. The shift may be messy, but in many ways it's more controlled than a sudden collapse would have been. For the rest of the world, this marks the beginning of a new multipolar reality, one where power is distributed more evenly and where countries are forced to rethink what it means to be an ally and how to navigate a more competitive global landscape. It will be fascinating to see how the US and the rest of the world adapt to this new changing global order. And that's my thoughts. Now, I would really love to hear your thoughts, so please comment down below. I think this is going to be an absolutely massive change, and I think it's kind of amazing what has happened in just a couple of weeks of the Donald Trump presidency. It's obviously Elon Musk is playing a huge role in this, and that's also very interesting. I may make another video about that in the future. Anyway, let me know what you think, but as always, for now, take care.